Taking time to be with us for our Data Matters Forum on the Economy. We are delighted to have Dr. Narayana Kosher-Lakota here with us to talk about the state of our economy and to help us collect information from you about the data you need to understand what's going on in our region. Before Dr. Kosher-Lakota speaks, and while we're waiting for the great staff here at the School of Mines to bring out your meals, let me take a moment just to kind of explain our project. What you see up here online is our website, blackhillsknowledgenetwork.org. You can think of it in some sense as an online library. It's a regional information hub where we're trying to provide data and information vital to the community. You may ask why we launched this project, and the answer is a kind of a paradox. I'm sure all of you have buzzing in your pockets right now some smartphone or iPad, or you've got your computer somewhere nearby, or you left it at the office, and when you get home you've got your television, and all of us feel like we are drowning, literally drowning in information. So how could it be that there's any place or anywhere where there might be a shortfall? Well, over the last 20 years, the rise of cable television and the internet have transformed the local market for news and information. Rather than wake up reading the morning paper, many people check Facebook, email, CNN, or Fox, and maybe even never get to a local information provider. This shift has consequences in two directions. First, for our local media outlets, they've seen a severe drop in their local revenues. It's happening all across the country. Newspapers have lost almost 80% of the ad revenues that they had 20 years ago. With lower revenues, they have to economize, reducing staff and coverage in an effort to remain in the black. Any one of you who remembers the sound of a Sunday paper 20 years ago hitting your driveway in the morning and think of what that sound is like today knows there's a big difference. A lot of pages are missing. So the trend is not good. In a recent Dakota poll, 60% of South Dakotans said that if their local newspaper disappeared tomorrow, it would have little or no impact on their community. The second consequence of the transformation of the information economy is actually equally distressing. As more and more people look elsewhere for their news and information, they are less informed about local issues and less likely to be engaged citizens in their local community. This means fewer people voting, attending city council or school board meetings, or even volunteering with local nonprofits. Ironically, even as the supply of information locally is diminishing, our expectations are rising. I mean, all of us know that feeling. You get a question at the dinner table, a question at the office. Well, I'm going to Google it. I'll have the answer in 3 seconds. But the reality is that Google doesn't always give us what we need, especially when we're talking about local information. Because that information is only available if local providers, including local government, local nonprofits, and local businesses, have made that information available, and it's readily retrievable and discernible, which is not always the case. This is where the Black Hills Knowledge Network comes in, and this is where 21st century librarians come in. In the 20th century, local libraries focused on connecting communities to what I call the big world. In other words, if your kid had a 4th grade report on China or New York or someplace far away, they went to the library and they got that information. And you felt connected to that larger place. Well, today, anybody from their kitchen table with their laptop who's got an internet connection can do that same thing. And there are businesses all over the place aggregating, databasing, organizing that information so that you or your child can find what you need about New York or China or someplace as far away as Sioux Falls. But that information, there are not providers who are organizing and databasing that information on a local level in the same way. So we have a problem of diminishing supply as our local media providers struggle to stay abreast with diminishing revenues. And we have a problem of rising expectations as everyone thinks that they can get the answer to any question in 3 seconds. So if I want to know what the zoning is in my neighborhood, I can find that in 3 seconds. I want to know what the school board plans to do next year to deal with the budget cuts. I should be able to find that in 3 seconds. If I want to know what the crime statistics are for my community or the community I want to move into, I should be able to find that in 3 seconds. But the reality is we're not all there yet in terms of making that information available locally. So our project is designed to work with local government, local news organizations, and local nonprofits to help organize, database, tag, make that information more retrievable. We're not replacing anybody who's providing content. Librarians don't provide content, not generally. Our job has been to organize and make that information retrievable and findable. And that's what our project is about. Since we launched our regional beta site roughly a year ago, we've received support from many organizations and individuals. As I said, the project is sponsored by the Black Hills Area Community Foundation and a consortium of public libraries, including Rapid City, Spearfish, Sturgis, Custer, Deadwood, Lee, Wall, and Whitewood. We're hoping that Wall Community College will be joining us soon. We've received funding from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Bush Foundation, Black Hills Vision, Regional Health, the South Dakota Community Foundation, the Rapid City Library Foundation, Friends of the Rapid City Library, the South Dakota Humanities Council, and other local funders. We're grateful for all of the support. On the site, we're trying to do 3 things. First, we're doing news and information aggregation, which is what I just talked about. Second, our online community archive, which includes photographs and documents about the history of our region, is intended to deepen our sense of community here and to provide policymakers and citizens a way to understand the backstory to current issues. Finally, our community indicators, we're trying to collect data and statistics about key issues in our region so that you as policymakers, you as nonprofit leaders, you as engaged citizens can find the information you need, whether you have to write a grant, whether you're making policy, whatever it is. And I think one of the things that's been a real strength is the Rapid City Public Library, working with the Mayor's Office and the City Council, has really been working to make the local library really the knowledge base for the community in which we go. Now these data matters focus, and this is the third and final in our series of 3, are focused particularly on aggregating data and statistics in first education, health and wellness, and today we're focused on the economy. This year we received a generous grant from the Bush Foundation to help us develop the community indicators. And we are working with Wilder Research in the Twin Cities to develop a data feed or an underlying platform to be able to make all this data available. What we've got right now on our site is a lot of data, but it's links to other people's data, or it's one-off data visualizations we've created, or tables we've created. We're hoping for an underlying database that will actually allow you to kind of customize what you're able to retrieve by the end of the year. So to help us gather vital information on the data that you need, we have pulled together these data matters forms. And as lunch starts, what I'd like you to do is, every one of you has got a survey on your table. I'd like you to take a brief minute to fill out this survey. It'll help us immeasurably to know what kind of data you're looking for and what we can provide to help you. And while you're doing that, while we're serving the lunches, I just want to take care of some other business too. I want to make a few introductions. First of all, Regina Jar, the director of Black Hills Area Community Foundation. Regina, can you wave your hand? Over there. Regina and the Community Foundation have provided critical support to this project. The Knight Foundation offered competitive grants across the country for projects like ours, although I have to say ours is unusual that it has a library focus. And we couldn't have competed for that grant without being able to use the community foundations. Only community foundations or other place-based foundations were eligible. A number of members of the Black Hills Area Community Foundation board are here: Kitty Kinsman, Haven Stuck, Joanne Kappa, Mike Tennyson, Richard Wallstrom. All of you could wave your hands too, that'd be great. Thank you for being here. To help us guide the content on the site, we have a board of content advisors, and we have some members of that board here: John Ucera, Sid Goss, Mike Derby, Denise Ross. You could wave your hands. Our key partner in this project has been the Rapid City Public Library. Greta Chapman has championed this cause when we first started experimenting it with experimenting with it 3 years ago. She's here along with a number of people from the Rapid City Public Library, Red, Wade, and all the Rapid City Public Library staff that are here. Thank you. We're also very pleased to acknowledge our co-sponsors for today's Data Matters Forum, in particular Maggie Arsdorff-Schuby is here from the Bush Foundation. Thank you, Maggie. Linda Rady from the Rapid City Chamber, Ben Snow from Rapid City Economic Development Partnership, Sharon Sprague, I think, is here from the Rapid City Library Foundation, Jim Aberley from Black Hills Vision, and Mayor Sam Poyker from the City of Rapid City. All of them helped to put this event together, and I appreciate it very much. In a few minutes, Mayor Corker's agreed to introduce Dr. Kocher-Lakota, but I also want to extend my personal thanks to his staff for the great work and really great cooperation that they have given us in putting this event together. Finally, also, thank you to President Wharton of the School of Mines, who couldn't be with us here today. He's traveling, and to all the staff who have helped to put this event together. Good. Now I'm going to stop talking and let you eat. I think we're getting some of those meals out there, and we'll give you about 15 minutes or so. And it looks like already I get to give away something. This is really great. I think this was going to be a game show format today. But anyone who's missing their keys, otherwise I'll raffle them off. Come and see me. Okay, I got it. Thank you. One last thing, let me point out, there are also 3x5 cards at your table. Dr. Kocher-Lakota gave a press conference this morning for the local media. We've also got some national reporters here from Wire Services. We're welcoming them to Rapid City. Glad to have them here. 3x5 cards are for the lay audience, the non-professional journalists among you. And we invite you to offer your questions for Dr. Kocher-Lakota after his speech. We'll be collecting them before the speech, so if you want to write them out ahead of time, we'll get them up here so that we can ask them when he's done. If you have any concerns or anything else you need, please see me and we'll take care of it. Thank you. Kick off this event, Mayor Sam Poyker of the City of Rapid City.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Eric, for the invitation to be here today and for your leadership in putting on this event and hosting this event. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome and introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Mariana Kocher-Lakota, who has a last name almost as complicated as mine. The President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He became the 12th President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis in October 2009. The bank is responsible for the 9th Federal Reserve District, which includes Montana, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, northwestern Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. As one of 12 Federal Reserve banks in the country, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis contributes to a variety of Federal Reserve System functions. It operates a nationwide payments system and distributes the currency that we all use every day. It supervises and regulates member banks and bank holding companies, and it serves as a fiscal agent for the U.S. Treasury. Dr. Kocher-Lakota also serves on the Federal Open Market Committee, also known as FOMC, led by the Federal Reserve Bank Chairman Ben Bernanke. The FOMC meets every 6 to 8 weeks to determine monetary policy for the United States. These policies exert a major influence on interest rates for businesses and consumers across the country. Born in Baltimore in 1963 and raised by parents who each held a PhD in statistics, he graduated from high school at the age of 15. He earned a degree in math from Princeton University in 1983 and went on to receive his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He has taught at Northwestern University, the University of Iowa, go Hawkeyes, Stanford University, and the University of Minnesota. He resides in Gold Valley, Minnesota area with his wife Barbara and 2 Australian Shepherds, and 3 horses. And as an economist, he is recognized as a leading expert on the effect of macroeconomic policies on asset prices and financial bubbles. And we were just talking before this, and the doctor and I, and he was last in the Rapid City area approximately 39 to 40 years ago. Rapid City was very different. The spirit of the community remains very much the same, but the community has gone through a lot since that time. And we're commemorating and remembering the 40th anniversary of 1972 flood very soon, and that event helped transform our community. It was tragic, but transformed our community in many ways. And today, our community is vibrant and booming. We have a 4.2% unemployment rate. Underemployment is an issue for us, and it's something that we've been working on. But as all of us in our personal and professional lives work to balance budgets and plan for the future, we are fortunate to have Dr. Koshal Lakota here with us today to provide some insights into our regional and national economies. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Narayana Koshal Lakota. Now, one more thing to add. Dr. Eric Abramson assured me that you have a sense of humor, so if this flops, this is all his fault. But I brought with me an official city pin I'd like to present to you, and we wanted to let you know that when we run out, we just print more.
I'm not sure why it's supposed to be so funny. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks to Eric for all his efforts in organizing this event. I'm delighted to be here, and it's just been a very exciting morning. Had dialogues with people in the sort of finance area, with local business leaders, local business conditions, and so I've already learned a lot by being here. It's a great pleasure to be here, in particular as part of the Regional Data Forum. As an economist, as Sam mentioned, a child of 2 statisticians, I'm pretty much almost by definition a data geek, and so it's especially heartwarming to be here during this event. And I want to especially thank, as I mentioned, I want to thank those of you who took time from your busy schedules to meet with my members of my staff and myself this morning to discuss the Black Hills area economy and its challenges and opportunities. It is especially important for monetary policymakers to have a deep understanding of how the economy works, and one of the ways that we attain that understanding is through opportunities like this. The comments and questions that you all share, whether in meetings or at lunch or in a question and answer session that's going to follow this talk, will all help to shape my thinking about the economy and about policy. So I became president of the Minneapolis Fed in October of 2009, and one of my main objectives since then has been to make both the Minneapolis Fed and the Federal Reserve System more open and more transparent. And I've been delighted to learn that I'm not all alone in this pursuit of greater openness. I see many positive developments along these lines throughout the system, especially on the part of the Federal Open Market Committee. The FOMC, as was mentioned, is the monetary policy-making arm of the Federal Reserve. It meets every 6 to 7 weeks to chart the course of monetary policy. And the members of the Board of Governors in Washington and the presidents of the 12 regional feds, including me, all take part in these meetings. So today I will talk about a significant improvement in the FOMC's communication about monetary policy. In January of 2012, the FOMC released a consensus statement describing its long-run framework. Congress has given the Federal Reserve a dual mandate to promote maximum employment and to promote price stability. The January framework statement is important because it outlines the strategy the FOMC follows in order to implement the dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment. As you will hear, the framework statement provides a quantitative definition for price stability through a numerical target for inflation. It does not do the same for maximum employment. And and I will spend a considerable amount of time discussing this latter aspect of the statement and its relevance for current policy. This picture will be an important part of that. Before proceeding, I'll remind you that my remarks today reflect my own thoughts and not necessarily those of others in the Federal Reserve System. Let me begin with some historical context. Over the past 30 years, central banks all over the world have become much more transparent about their objectives and how their current actions allow them to achieve those objectives. This transparency is widely viewed by both policymakers and scholars as an important means of enhancing the effectiveness of monetary policy. Now, most central banks aim to keep medium-term inflation low and stable at around 2% annually. And they have been quite successful in that goal for the past 20 or 25 years. They view that success as being due in part to their communicating on an ongoing basis about how their current policy actions are consistent with that goal of 2% inflation. So there are at least two benefits of transparency. The first is broadly appreciated. By being clear about their objectives, central banks are better able to achieve those objectives. For example, if the central bank announces its inflation target is 2% per year, firms and employees know that wages need to grow by 2% to keep up with the cost of living. And that knowledge helps keep wages from growing so fast that firms have to raise prices by more than 2% to cover their labor costs. And that in turn contributes to keeping inflation under control. So in brief then, transparency is a way to anchor people's inflationary expectations. Now the second benefit of transparency is less appreciated, but I think it's no less important. A transparent central bank is more accountable to the public. It is because it is forced to be more disciplined in ensuring that its policy actions are in fact consistent with its policy objectives. The central bank knows the public will be able to track its performance. When performance matches words, the public will have an even stronger belief in the central bank, which serves to anchor inflation expectations even more solidly. So there's been a trend towards central bank transparency internationally. What about here in the United States? I think we can all take pride in the fact that under Chairman Bernanke and under his predecessor, Chairman Greenspan, the Fed has made enormous strides in transparency. It is easy to forget that as recently as 1993, so less than 20 years ago, the Fed would act and not tell anyone what it had done in 90 days. It was not until 2000 that the FOMC began issuing a statement that many of us now take for granted. And it was a decade ago that the roll call vote of FOMC members was added to the statement. So there's been substantial progress in monetary policy transparency over the past 15 or so years, going from a point where the FOMC would act and not tell anyone for 90 days to the current situation where there's a release of a statement and a vote. So with that in mind, at the beginning of 2011, so the beginning of last year, the committee had arrived at three main forms of communication on policy. So after every one of these 8 meetings, immediately after, the committee issues a carefully worded, a brief statement intended to describe the current state of the economy and the current stance of monetary policy. Second, 3 weeks after each meeting, the committee issues a carefully worded set of minutes that provides a longer, but still relatively high level description of interactions within the meeting. Third, after the January, April, June, and October, November meetings, depending which month that takes place, the FOMC releases a summary of economic projections. Now, these projections are the projections that are provided by all the meeting participants. And among other things, these quarterly releases will contain information about the meeting participants' goals for medium-run inflation and unemployment over the next, by medium run, I mean roughly over the next 5 to 6 years. Okay, so that's where we stood at the beginning of 2011. There have been several changes in FOMC communications over the past year, including the introduction of regular press conferences by the chairman, and the regular release of FOMC's participants' individual assessments of the appropriate path of short-term interest rates. And I'm going to spend my time today, and both of these are significant, but I want to spend my time today discussing the change that I view as the most important. The FOMC's release in January of 2012 of a 5-paragraph statement describing its long-run framework. Now, this statement is not important because it does not signify any change in the committee's approach to policy, to making policy. But I think it's an important step forward in the committee's communication of that approach to the public. In particular, I think this statement is providing the basic principles of how the committee goes about implementing the statutory dual mandate that I mentioned earlier, that monetary policy should promote price stability and maximum employment. Now, I'm not going to go through the statement in any detail. Frankly, I don't think there's any need for me to do so. It's short, it's, I think, remarkably well worded, and part of that is it deliberately shies away from technical language. I encourage all of you, indeed all Americans, to read it when you have the opportunity. It's located on the Board of Governors website. What I'm going to do instead is to focus on 4 aspects of this framework statement that was released in January. The four obviously that I view as especially important. Okay, so first key aspect of the framework is it provides a specific translation of the term price stability. And it translates it into a 2% target for inflation. The American public need guess no longer about the Federal Reserve's inflation intentions, either on the upside, which often gets more of the attention, but or on the downside either. The Federal Reserve is aiming to keep inflation at 2%. Second, the framework describes how the committee weighs the 2 mandates, maximum employment, promoting maximum employment, promoting price stability, against one another. And I think what the key here is that it stresses that the 2 mandates are actually typically complementary to one another. In the sense that keeping unemployment from rising too high also keeps inflation from falling too low. And I think this point of the complementarity of our 2 mandates is often underemphasized in popular discussions of monetary policy. Third, the framework statement enjoyed broad consensus support among meeting participants. And I think this suggests that any changes in the framework statement will require that same level of broad consensus support. In this sense, I think one can think of the framework as really being like a constitution. It can change, but it will take a broad consensus of support among meeting participants to implement that change. So I've moved very quickly through these first 3, these key elements of the framework statement. Inflation target of 2%, typical complementarity of the 2 mandates, and the quasi-constitutionality of the statement. The 4th key feature of the statement is that while it provides a numerical target for inflation, it does not provide a similar explicit quantitative interpretation of the 2nd mandate, maximum employment. And I want to spend the rest of my time discussing why it does not do so. So I'll start with a quote from the framework statement itself. The maximum level of employment is largely determined by non-monetary factors that affect the structure and dynamics of the job market. What are these non-monetary factors to which the statement refers? There are many. Population trends, the incentives built into the tax system, the incentives built into the social insurance safety nets, the returns to human capital accumulation by young people, and simply social norms. The FOMC has no control over these non-monetary factors. Its job is to attain the maximum of employment attainable through monetary policy, taking these other non-monetary factors that I've mentioned as given. Now, it's important to note that this long list of non-monetary factors includes non-monetary policies. It follows that even if employment is close to the maximum level that's achievable through monetary policy, may well be non-monetary policy levers that could be used to raise employment still higher. For example, suppose that Congress and the President chose to reduce the payroll tax paid by employers. Such a move would provide an additional incentive to employers to hire more workers, albeit at the cost of increasing the deficit. But providing this incentive to employers would increase employment and reduce unemployment. Now, all of these non-monetary factors, policy or otherwise, fluctuate over time. Their changes in turn generate fluctuations in the level of maximum employment that's achievable through monetary policy. And these fluctuations are often hard to gauge on a real-time basis. And I'm going to spend some time today describing why I believe that the committee faces an especially large amount of uncertainty about the level of maximum employment that it can hope to achieve. So I'm going to start by showing you 4 graphs. Graphs are 4 measures of the recent adverse changes in U.S. labor market performance. Now, to understand the graphs, it's helpful to recall that economists define the labor force to include 2 groups. It's all those people over 16 years of age that either have a job or have looked for a job in the past 4 weeks. That's what the labor force is. And then all the charts are going to depict annual data through the year 2011. Okay, so here's the first graph. And it depicts the evolution of the unemployment rate over time. And that's the fraction of people in the labor force who have looked for a job in the past 4 weeks. And the graph shows that after rising sharply from 2007 to 2009, and the shaded area here is depicting the recession that began in December of 2007, and this data is having ended in June of 2009. But after rising sharply from 2007 to 2009, the unemployment rate has been falling slowly. So that's the first graph, the unemployment rate. The next graph is what's called the employment population ratio. This is the fraction of people people over the age of, excuse me, it's a fraction of people with these ages who have a job. So what we've done is focus on people aged 25 to 54, just to strip out some of the demographic effects that sometimes people worry about conflating against these pictures. So these are so-called prime age workers. Now we can see a sharp decline in this ratio from 2007 to 2009. And in contrast to the unemployment rate, there has been no noticeable recovery in this measure. So the fraction of people aged 25 to 54 fell sharply beginning in 2007, and you really don't see you can't see that starting to come back up. So that's the second picture. Now the third graph is a depiction of the fraction of the population in the age of 25 to 54 who are in the labor force. So these are people with this age 25 to 54 who either have a job or have looked for a job in the past 4 weeks. Now, I think an interesting aspect of this graph is you really start to see it come down pretty early on, in 2000 itself. It comes down, it rises back up, and it's fairly flat, and then it really accelerates beginning in 2008, and there's a downward trend that accelerates in 2008. Okay, so these are 3 of the 4 pictures I want to show you. The last one is the most complicated. What is this graph? This is a depiction of the relationship of unfilled job openings and unemployment over time. So the horizontal axis in this graph is the unemployment rate, and the vertical axis is what's called the job openings or vacancy rate. Each point of the graph corresponds to a different year. So for the year 2001, for example, you take the unemployment rate for that year, take the vacancy rate for that year, and put a point on the graph. 2002, you put another point on the graph corresponding to the unemployment rate for that year, and vacancy rate for that year. Now, when the economy is doing well, firms usually hire more workers, and they find it more challenging to fill fill their available openings. So the unemployment rate tends to be low, and the vacancy rate tends to be high. So as the economy improves, we should be moving in the towards the upper left in the picture, to the northwest. Conversely, as times get worse, we should move to the southeast. And this creates a curve that runs from the northwest to the southeast, and that curve is known as the Beveridge curve, after an economist. Now, in the Great Recession and its aftermath, so I don't know if I can use a point here. Yeah. This point here is 2009, 2010, 2011. What are we seeing here? The Beveridge curve is not just running up and down like this, it's actually shifted outward. Now, this represents a decline in the ability of the labor market to form mutually beneficial matches between workers and firms. This outward shift means that firms can't fill their available job openings as readily as you would expect, given how high the unemployment rate is. There's more job openings out here in 2011 than we would have expected, given an unemployment rate of well over 8%. So that's 4 pictures about the U.S. Labor market outcomes remain notably worse than prior to the recession. The unemployment rate has been starting to come down, but labor force participation has been falling steadily. The employment population ratio remains near its low point, and the Beveridge curve shows considerable deterioration in labor market matching efficiency. Big question: how persistent will these changes in the U.S. labor market prove to be? Economists, as is their one, hold at least 2 views on this question. How many economists you ask? So the first view is guided by patterns in post-World War II data for the United States. And these patterns, I'm not going to show you that, but these patterns would suggest that the current deterioration in U.S. labor market performance is indeed reversible under appropriate policy. We've seen these kind of changes during recessions, and then during recoveries they reverse themselves. The second view is less sanguine. It says that the post-World War II data do not contain an economic crisis of the kind or magnitude that hit the United States in 2008. And such a crisis could well have a different kind of impact on labor markets than the earlier post-war recessions. Now, this latter view is also informed by data, but it's informed by data from other countries, not from the United States. So my staff and I have recently been taking a close look at data from Sweden. Now, why Sweden? In the early 1990s, Sweden was hit by a financial, banking, and currency crisis all at the same time. What one might call a triple crisis. Of course, other industrialized countries, most notably Japan, have experienced these kinds of crises. Why we focused on Sweden, I should say, is because it's generally viewed as having dealt with the triple crisis in a highly effective fashion. It's generally viewed as a success story. So in 2007, OECD economists write, Sweden's economy has made a remarkable recovery from the major crisis of the early 1990s. And you can find similar quotes from a wide variety of sources. But despite this success, this bonds of success, the triple crisis has had a profound and highly persistent effect on the Swedish labor market. So I'm going to show you the same graphs that I showed you for the US, I'm going to show you for Sweden. Let's see the Swedish unemployment rate. So the shaded gray area here for Sweden is the time that the triple crisis I referred to was at its peak from the years 1991 to 1993. So the Swedish unemployment rate from 1980 to 1990 had never been above 4% and was typically closer to 2%. After 1993, the unemployment rate was never much below 6%. So that's the unemployment rate. This is the Swedish employment population ratio, again focusing on those age groups I mentioned earlier, 25 to 54. From 1980 to 1990, the employment population ratio grew steadily in Sweden and peaked at over 91%. Now, I actually think this is fall that took place in this number over something like a 2 to 3 year period. The way to think about, realize how amazing it is to think about sort of one minus it, the fraction of people who don't have a job in Sweden who are aged 25 to 54. In 1990, only about 9% of the Swedish population aged 25 to 54 did not have a job. In the space of 3 years, that doubled to 18%. That's a pretty big change in your labor market. Now, what I want to emphasize though more is what happened after that, after the gray shaded area, after the Trump crisis. The ratio definitely trended upward slightly, but it's remained below 6% for most of this period. So you definitely see a decline and a persistent decline in the employment population. I'm going to show you labor force participation now. And it's sort of the same story. From 1980 to 1990, this fraction rose to a high of over 92%. After 1993, it was typically around 88% and never much above 90%. And finally, we can look at the beverage curve. So this is the same plot of unemployment rates versus vacancies for Sweden that I showed you for the U.S., starting in 1980. So, and it's essentially, you see that you're running up and down one curve here from 1980 to 1990 or 91. Then there's the big triple crisis. Here's 1992. Here's 1993. We move back up, and now since then, they've moved along this curve instead. So there's been that deterioration, the labor market matching efficiency that I described for the United States. It took place in Sweden, and it stayed with them for the next 17 years. Okay, so to sum up, these 4 measures of Swedish labor market performance declined markedly after the triple crisis of the early 90s. And at least up until now, this decline has proved to be a permanent. I should note, too, that these changes took place over a relatively short period of time. I would say a remarkably short period of time. In its February 1995 inflation report, the Riksbank, the Swedish central bank, suggests that the rate of unemployment they view as sustainable over the long run had risen from 2 to 3% back in 1990 to 6% in less than 5 years. Their assessment, which was made, again, back in 1995, has proven to be a remarkably accurate characterization of the Swedish labor market over the next 15 years. Now, it is important to emphasize, of course, there are many institutional differences between Sweden and the United States, especially in terms of tax systems and social safety nets. It would be a mistake to conclude from the Swedish data alone that the recent decline in U.S. labor market measures is inevitably a permanent. But Sweden is not atypical. Cross-country research from Reinhard, among others, has found that financial crises can be followed by sustained increases in unemployment. So I do think the Swedish data, especially given that they come from a country generally regarded as an exemplar of how to handle a financial crisis, have to be viewed as informative. At a minimum, Sweden's experience forces us to contemplate the possibility that erosion of labor market performance that we've seen in the United States over the past 5 years can be highly persistent, even under appropriate monetary policy. So, over the past 10 minutes or so, I've talked about the recent adverse changes in U.S. labor market performance, and I've talked about 2 sharply different ways to view those changes. One, they're largely reversible under appropriate monetary policy, and the second, they're likely to be highly persistent, even under appropriate policy. These 2 possibilities suggest the FOMC is confronted with an unusually high degree of uncertainty about the level of maximum employment that it can achieve. And this uncertainty translates directly into a corresponding uncertainty about the appropriate approach to policy. So policymakers who see deterioration in labor market performance as reversible using monetary policy will typically favor more accommodative policy than those who view the deterioration as more protracted. Now, we can, unfortunately, use other sources of information to reduce the level of uncertainty about maximum level of employment achievable through monetary policy. The maximum employment for monetary policy is widely viewed as a level of employment that is sustainable through monetary policy actions without an acceleration in inflation. So even though we can't directly observe maximum employment, we do observe inflation. So and its behavior can then be a useful signal of how close we are to the maximum level of employment achievable by the FOMC. So what's been happening? Inflation was distinctly higher in 2011 than in 2010, and it continues to run above the FOMC's target of 2%. Even core measures of inflation, strip out energy, goods and services, and food, went up notably from 2010 to 2011. Now I see these changes in inflation as a signal that our country's current labor market performance is much closer to maximum employment, given the tools available to the FOMC, than the post-World War II U.S. data alone would suggest. And as I've argued in the past, appropriate monetary policy should be responsive to those kinds of signals. Now, it is worth reiterating, though, a point that I made earlier. Maximum employment for monetary policy is not the same as maximum employment for all policymakers. Congress and the President can choose to provide direct subsidies to employers for hiring. Such subsidies will increase the federal deficit. They do have the power to increase maximum employment for the FOMC. So let me wrap up. The overarching theme of my speech has been monetary policy transparency. And I pointed out the FOMC has made major strides toward greater transparency in recent decades, especially over the past 2 years. These steps mean that we are more accountable to the public, and more effective as policymakers. It's especially noteworthy that in our January framework statement, the committee has set a clear quantitative objective for our price stability mandate of 2% inflation per year. I think all Americans can take great pride in these improvements in FOMC communication over the past 15 or so years. Of course, there's still more that can be done. Too often our communications about the future course of the economy imply considerably more certainty than we can ever possibly have. We should be more transparent about the uncertainties that we face as policymakers. We can and should use scenario analysis to describe how our policy will respond to new information about those uncertainties. Along these lines, we can learn from the practices of other central banks. For example, in today's talk, I spent a great deal of time discussing the uncertainties associated with formulating a quantitative measure of maximum employment for the FOMC. An interested Swedish citizen would have been able to read many rich and detailed discussions of exactly this issue in the Swedish Central Bank's monetary policy reports in the mid-1990s. Thanks for listening to my remarks. I'll be happy to take your questions, which I guess were submitted ahead of time, so unlikely to relate to what I said, but on what I talked about or anything else. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher-Lakota, for those remarks. So we've got a number of questions here, and I'll start off by the first one is related to managing the deficit that you're talking about. You said that Congress has the option of increasing the deficit to promote maximum employment. Should Congress adopt a Bowles-Simpson plan?
Yeah, I was talking more broadly than about any specific plan. I think that it's important for us as a country to be dealing with the fiscal imbalances that exist in our country. And that fiscal imbalance is largely driven over the longer term, over the next 10 to 20 years, by the fact that we have an aging population. We've set up certain obligations to that aging population, and through Social Security and Medicare, and we're going to have a smaller tax base for which to collect revenue to pay for those obligations. That creates a tension between our tax collections and the obligations that we've written down. We have to get that tension has to be resolved in some fashion, either by raising tax revenues in some form or by lowering the obligations. That's the tension that has to be dealt with. It is a long-term issue, and I for one, I am heartened by the fact that Congress has started to talk about it at this early date. I think that's very laudable. And it's not just my opinion. That opinion is reflected in financial markets. When you see the kind of high prices that U.S. debt, both real and nominal, command in financial markets, that's a sign that people are betting their money, lots of it, on exactly the ability of the U.S. to deal with this fiscal balance that I described. I think the Bull Simpson plan is one of many, one plan that's on the table that tries to get this. But I think the important thing is to have plans and start talking about it. That's what I like about that one.
I should have started with this question. With the Black Hills Knowledge Network, we're all about trying to give people context so that they can focus on problems. But here's a real basic one. Go establish the Federal Reserve and why.
Well, the answer to that is Congress. Congress established the Federal Reserve through the Federal Reserve Act, and that's and then that means you did. The voters established it. So why does the Federal Reserve exist? I mean, I think its purpose has evolved over time, but essentially it was to provide a way to fend off. The original purpose of the Federal Reserve was to provide a way to fend off the kind of financial crisis that we observed in 2008. Provide a source of liquidity, but liquidity became extremely scarce in financial markets. The creators of the Federal Reserve had observed over the preceding 50 years or so that maybe longer, that the U.S. had been hit by financial crises that ended up having relatively adverse effects on the economy, and the Federal Reserve was put in place to deal with that. Over time, the purpose of the organization has evolved to be more about having an independent control of monetary policy, that independent in the sense that it's somewhat isolated from political influences. Fundamentally, it's grounded and controlled by Congress, but Congress has set it up as an independent agency, so as to insulate monetary policy from the political impulses of Congress. So that's the nature of the organization.
Thanks. So this goes really to much of what you just said in your address. The question is, some suggest that the Federal Reserve Bank has been negligent not to have full employment as a stated goal. And I think you've just given us quite a bit of information about kind of how you define full employment and particularly how it's affected by monetary policy or interest rates. There's only so much you can do. I think part of what you're also suggesting, maybe you might want to talk about this a little more, is if monetary policy can't solve the problem of full employment, what are the other steps that we as a people need to be thinking about?
I offered one suggestion in my talk about a way to incentivize employment through subsidies that are being offered by Congress and the President. Those are not costless. And so it just introduced you to think through the trade-offs between what level of employment you want as a society and what are the tools available. I've suggested one. In general, I think there are choices that can be made about helping on this dimension. I think one thing that would having more certainty about the long-term fiscal picture is one way, I think, to introduce a level of certainty for firms that would probably engage them more in the hiring process. But yeah, there is only so much monetary policy can do. There are other choices that can be made. Those choices are not costless. Fortunately, I'm not the one who has to weigh that cost balance, except from the privacy of voting, which is up to you as well.
So this kind of goes to that same point, or amplifies on it. Since it's unlikely that Congress and the President will avoid going over the fiscal cliff, what tools and contingencies does the Federal Reserve have or consider?
That's a question that, speaking for an analogy to draw as I want, I don't accept the premise of the question. I don't think that that's the way I'm looking at things. I think the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, recently released a study about what would happen if we went over the fiscal cliff. The macroeconomic consequences in their estimation for 2013 would be dire ones. Their estimation the economy would return to recession. I don't see that is a policy choice that Congress and the President will end up making. And so my benchmark, our forecast is in that. With that said, we have to have a plan for contingency. If I saw a forecast for declining inflation and rising unemployment, as the CBO has sketched would happen if we did go with the fiscal cliff, that would be an argument, I think, for more accommodating monetary policy. Would that be able to forestall all the effects that the CBO described? I don't think so. I think there are limits for monetary policy.
Can you comment a little bit on the Greek and the euro situation and how that's likely to affect the U.S. in short and long term?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an ongoing saga, and it's going to keep going. I think that, I think European policymakers have faced a very challenging situation, and again, I think that they've handled it pretty well. So where do I see things unfolding? My own benchmark outlook is that I think that European policymakers will continue to stay on top of the situation. It's one where it is, I think there's always optimism that things have been solved, and then it turns out problems keep up, and there's more steps to be taken. A strong European economy is an important element for the United States. How does it affect our economy? I think it's useful. I always divide it into two pieces. One is directly through trade. So if Europe is strong economically to demand U.S. goods, that means that firms will hire more workers to produce those goods here in the United States, and that's good for U.S. employment. That effect actually turns out to be relatively small. It's there, but it's a relatively small one. Trade with Europe is a small fraction of our trade, and trade for such an economy like the U.S., which is such a large economy, trade is relatively small for the U.S. as well. So we're talking about a small piece of a small piece. That trade component is not a big deal from the macroeconomic effect. What you worry about more, and if you look at the Federal Open Market Committee statement, it talks about strains in financial markets developing. What you're worried about is that that fear about what's going on in Europe will spill over into fears in the U.S. markets. That'll make people less willing to hold risky investments like stocks, undertake any kind of risky investments like building a factory or hiring a worker. Those kinds of fears, that fear spillover is really what you try to. That's the contingency that we're worried about. And again, we have our monetary policy tools to try to combat that. We also have, it came to the point where there was a manifestation of the kind of freezing up of financial markets that took place in 2008. And I'll emphasize that I view that as I can't say highly unlikely strongly enough, but we still have to plan for it. We have tools available just as we did then to deal with that eventuality.
Backing up to sort of more local angle, can you talk a little bit about how the Federal Reserve Bank, through its policies and through its regulatory activities, affects local economies like ours here in Rapid City or in kind of the western region of Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota that we're a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard question to answer because I think it takes place in a variety of ways. Federal Reserve is engaged in making monetary policies I've talked about. We're engaged in the provision of payment services to banks. That's something that affects sort of the banks in the area. We have today we had a consumer finance dialogue, which is facilitated by our community development staff. That is another way that your Federal Reserve Bank is working for you. So there's just a large number of ways we interact with the local economy. I think events like this one really try to, I think, underscore the decentralization, the local nature of the Federal Reserve, that more than any other central bank, what we're about is listening to people in the local community and trying to figure out how to take that back and make use of it. But that operates in a wide variety of contexts.
In this region, energy markets are big. I mean, fluctuations of them. We've seen obviously the big boom on the Bakken oil fields up there. Can you talk about kind of your perspective on how people plan to manage those loans and busts.
Wow, I mean, those are questions that are certainly best handled by business people, because they're the ones who have to make the investments, have to make the decisions, and the choices associated with that. No, I visited Sydney, Montana last fall, and our board of directors is going to be meeting in Minot, North Dakota, in August, as a way to try to gather more information about the area. I think there's definitely a caution about investing in infrastructure in that area, infrastructure that I think would facilitate actually the extraction process. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 that people feel that in the 1980s they got a little burned by overinvestment in appropriate infrastructure, and they don't want to make that mistake again. At the same time, without that, it's hard to. There's a number of hurdles. It's hard to attract employees to a situation where they don't have good housing, and you don't have good schools for them to bring their families. So I hope that catch-22 in terms of public infrastructure and the extraction process can be resolved.
One of the ways in which the Federal Reserve affects the money supply is through the issuance of Treasury bills, Treasury issues. Should the Treasury, if I've got that right, should the Treasury issue 50 and 100-year maturity T-bonds since interest rates are at an all-time low?
Yeah, that's totally up to the Treasury. I don't want to comment. It's absolutely, it's outside of my jurisdiction.
This is I think it goes to the way the Federal Reserve operates again. Do you agree with the proposal to disallow any individuals employed by or owning an interest in a bank to serve on the Federal Reserve Board?
It's a very recent proposal, so it's as I said, Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress, and they're free to shape it in any way they want. I will say that as a president, I get a lot of incredibly useful information from the banking directors that serve on our boards, and I think it would be a loss to me as in my policy role to lose that valuable source of information. The people who serve as banking directors, we have a number of policies in place to insulate them from supervision and regulation of banking institutions. For example, our budget or employment for supervisors and regulation of the Minneapolis Fed is approved only by so-called Class C directors. Those are directors appointed from the public by the Board of Governors in Washington. So, I think that we already have the right kinds of processes in place to insulate the supervision and regulation process from apparent conflicts of interest without losing the valuable flow of information that we get from folks that have chosen to serve their country in that way.
I'm not sure of the context of this one, but the question is, how large is the tax collection from the unemployed or underemployed, and why would this monetary policy help?
So I'm not quite sure the relation to tax collection, but I can say something about how monetary policy tries to affect employment by keeping interest rates low, as the Federal Reserve is doing right now. Your people are forced to think to themselves: should I save the dollar and earn very low interest rate in my checking account or savings account, or even if I put it in the stock market, it seems like returns are low, or should I spend it? By keeping interest rates low, trying to encourage people to make the decision, I should go out and spend that money. By spending it, that'll lead companies to think, oh, there's going to be a lot of demand for goods, they'll go out and hire workers, and that's how you affect employment. So that's that channel of keeping market interest rates low, as the Federal Reserve is doing, is stimulating demand for consumption, as I just described. It also stimulates demand for investment by firms thinking, I can just retain these earnings, leave them sitting in an account somewhere, getting a very low interest rate, or I could expand my business, build a factory, and grow in that fashion. That's how monetary policy works.
I think those are most of our questions. Maybe take a second and just ask you a couple of questions on my own here to sort of go at some of the things you were talking about in your speech. First, you really talk about two main issues here, as you said. One is the transparency of policymaking by the Fed, and the second is this issue of sort of what is full employment and how do we get there with monetary policies. Let me take the transparency one first. Can you sort of explain for us why historically the Fed was not very transparent about its activities, and what's changing to make it more transparent?
Yeah, so I think they answered about, it has two parts to it. One is simply intellectually. I think that there was a recognition by both academics and policymakers that policy would be more effective if you told people about what you were trying to do and what you were doing. And it may seem obvious, may obviously seem obvious after you realize them, but there had to be an intellectual shift really within the study of the field. That's one aspect, and one of the leaders in this, I should add, is the chairman of the current chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Ed Bernanke. Both in his academic life as a professor at Princeton, he was someone who espouses very strongly. So that's one side, the intellectual side. The other side is that while communication is always important, transparency is always important, it's especially important right now. The reason for that is, I've described how making interest rates low can stimulate employment. We can't make interest rates go any lower, short-term interest rates go any lower than they currently are. So that means basically floating rate close to zero. So the way you try to affect policy stimulus at that point is by talking about how long you're planning to keep interest rates low. So that's really requires transparency. Really intelligent. It requires you to say something about what you expect the economy to what you expect policy. So I think it's both for pragmatic reasons, as I just described, and intellectual reasons.
Great. Secondly, going to the question of full employment, and this is our chance, in a sense, to get some help from the professor on this one. But looking at your chart here of the Beveridge group, this problem that we have on the right side with the fact that even though the demand for employment is going up, we're not placing people in those jobs. This is what people call structural unemployment. Is that correct? And what are the things that make for this structural unemployment?
Yeah, I think there is a host of possible issues that are involved, but it's essentially that firms, when they're looking for people to fill their jobs, are finding it harder to find those kinds of people in the pool of unemployed. So I'm being a little abstract about it, and that's because I think there's just a number of forces that are at work in thinking about what's at play there. You're only looking for highly skilled positions, for example. A lot of these vacancies in the Swedish case, so I wouldn't want to talk about that so much, but in the U.S. case, of more of the vacancies are firms are looking for skilled people, and more of the unemployed people don't have those skills, and you're going to have this kind of shift out in the Beveridge group that I just described. I should say though, when we talk about is it structural or not, it's structural if it becomes permanent. That's very important. So if you look at this picture, one interpretation that people have given to it is firms post vacancies, but they're not really looking that hard because they don't have that much demand for their goods. So that's going to create this outward shift I just described here as well. And then you would expect, as the economy improves, they're going to come back. The problem is, the challenge, and that's the one view of the world, and that's going to lead you to call more accommodative policy. The other view is this is a very persistent change because of characteristics in the workforce, the kinds of jobs that employers are looking for and the kinds of people that are looking for the jobs. There's a mismatch. That's going to mean this to be more permanent and persistent over time, and that's apparently the picture that we have this week. So the issue is going to be, the difference of viewpoint is this going to continue like this, or is it going to come back like that? That's really the issue. So as usual, the professor can tell you the question and not really tell you the answer.
Well, I want to thank you very much for coming here today. It's really been great for us to have you here in Rapid City. I have somewhere here, let me make sure I got the right pocket. We have a token for you to remember us by. This is a lapel pin of a buffalo head nickel with feathers so that when you're out in the west, you can show your colors. Please join me in thanking Dr. Martin. Thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate your interest. We will be keeping in touch with you about progress on the Black Coast Knowledge Network. We really appreciate all the information that you've given us on your surveys. If you've still got them on your table, please leave them there and we'll pick them up later. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.